people have questions, please do request to speak, and we've put up a little question format. Keep it about 1 minute if you can, and introduce yourself, etc. So please go on for a few more minutes, and then we'll start Q&A. And we'll also ask Mastodon to speak if you'd like.
Thank you, Robert. I know this has been such an interesting conversation. I think we can go on for multiple hours, but thank you for giving us a few more minutes. Patrícia, did you want to chime in? I saw you.
Yeah, no, just a quick comment to add on this about interoperability and things like this. I think we need just to have in mind that since if we have that approach of multiple clients, that in each client will be tackling different use cases, I think that is natural that we expect and that different clients will have different priorities in terms of main user actions and things like this. So this is a place that I'd like to bring up a quote from a senior colleague of mine that from a few years ago that told me something I never forgot, which is coherence is better than consistency. And basically what we mean here is that it is more important that
Sorry, is
the
Patrícia
different
up for everyone or just me?
Yeah, she's breaking up a little bit.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Do you mind repeating the quote, Patrícia?
Do you mind what? Sorry? Repeating.
The quote that you were reading?
Oh, yeah, of course. Which is coherence is better than consistency. So in design, what it was meant by this, it was that instead of focusing on having everything done the same across interfaces, it was more important that those interfaces made sense in their specific context and in the user context. So even if clients are different because they have different priorities, I think the important thing is that we can have something underlying that speaks the same language, because it needs to have this interoperability factor. But it's important to think that each user will have a different context and a different use case. And so therefore, I mean, it's natural that there will be differences across that we have to deal with.
Thank you, Patrícia. I have a couple more questions, but I'm going to hold off for those towards the end. And I see Aaron here. Aaron, did you have a question, or did you want to comment on the discussion?
Yeah, the question I had for the panelists is, the web started with Tim Berners-Lee in a very semantic place. We got tags like paragraph or list. And now we build web apps that are very pixel perfect. We have designers who really want to control what's happening. How do you think about that space? There's a lot of design space and levels of abstraction between a JSON object where I may not know what a field value means versus a GIF, which I can render pretty much everywhere, but it's very difficult to interpret in any way other than showing the pixels of that GIF. How do we decide how much control we want to give to a user agent versus how much control we want to give to the developer in what actually gets shown to a user?
Yeah.
Hey, Aaron, could you just mention where you're from, your context, please?
I'm Aaron Goldman. I've been pretty active in the Bluesky community, and I'm currently working as a security engineer at Twitter.
Awesome. Can I jump in on that one?
Go right ahead.
So this is a really, really interesting area for me, especially when I was working on the Tumblr stuff, because we allowed for any blog to use any HTML basically in their posts. You could style your blog however you wanted. But then we also had to figure out how to represent that within, the mobile apps and a desktop app at one point. And so we didn't want to basically build a browser every single time that we supported that. So we found a limited subset of the tags that we were able to support, and then we worked on translating from those themes to the sort of slimmed down subset. And I think that's one way to do it, but obviously it doesn't have full fidelity. Another area of inspiration here, I don't think this is the final answer, but is the work that has been done on embedding things across the web. So Notion is the product that I probably use this the most in. If you're not familiar with Notion, it's a sort of all-in-one knowledge base thing. But what they've built in that product is the ability to embed a Google Doc or a YouTube video or a tweet or whatever, and use as much as possible the native rendering from that service. So that feels like a way that we could also approach this when it comes to social networks. Like if I'm seeing a post from Tumblr, but I'm using Twitter as a client, what if we reach out to Tumblr in whatever way possible to actually just provide that? And there are performance considerations with that, and there's consistency issues with that. But to Patricia's point, like coherence maybe is a better solution than trying to make every post in a timeline look the same. If we can find a way to make them, if you're looking at a Notion page and you have a YouTube video and a Google Doc, yeah, these things look different, but they're still comprehensible in the way that they're laid out. So those are some early thoughts on that challenge.
Yeah, Rabu, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we have a universal interchange format, and it's JSON, and it's messy, and it's not perfect, and it's a bit inconsistent, but on the other hand, it's super accessible. It's like the original HTML. You can model the data, you can parse it, you can bring it into any programming language, and it's actually, like, even though the UI may be pixel perfect and everything else, if you look at what's going on underneath it with React and all the other similar web application frameworks, it's actually trading around all sorts of just JSON hashes of content. And so if we realize that that's our sort of our basis of things, then we can build a lot of interoperability and a lot of embeddability. And so it's not as bad as you think. I would also say that, Tim Berners-Lee is brilliant. And when he tried to build it the right way and build it correctly, and this goes back to Xanadu before that when you try and design it correct from the start and incorporate everything, you mess it up. And when you make it messy and accessible and hackable and not perfect, then you open it up to things moving on. And so I think that we have to not make this perfect, but we should make it accessible to people to hack on and play with. And it's okay if it's a mess, because a mess is
embrace the chaos.
Yep.
Did we lose Chris? I think he wanted to chime in as well. Looks like we lost
He said he
him.
had to run. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he had to drop off.
Okay, no worries. Aaron, did you have any other question?
No, thank you for the answer.
Awesome. Robert, do you want to let others on?
Sure. No one's raised their hand that currently is here, so please feel free to request to speak, and we'll put your question. In the meantime, Mastodon or Blaine Cook. There's Miles G. Let's give Miles G a minute. Please introduce yourself and direct your question to any of the panelists or all of them. Thank you. Miles G maybe is not on a phone device, a cell device.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes, go right ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, I turned off my Bluetooth just randomly. So my question is just about this interoperability question. Have people been thinking about AI and interoperability in as much as, in the old days, you'd have to build a user interface for a to-do app maybe in the future you can just, someone can just say in a social space, hey, can anyone help with this? And someone can say, yeah, I got it. And the AI can kind of interpret that and create a space around that. That means that the interop is a lot more flexible, which is kind of like the next version of where we're going with Cambria, I guess. Just wondering if there's any thoughts on that.
I guess I could take a stab at that one. I don't know, maybe. I think it's really tricky, though. I think what I find tricky about it is that the information that's conveyed by a design is so culturally sensitive, like the context of the social network that I'm in helps define the way that I interpret something. Like, what does a like mean? The meaning of the heart symbol has something to do with, and as people, if you've been on Twitter for a while, it changes over time as culture develops. And so I think that's what makes interop such a difficult challenge. Even little visual details of how you display stuff can really matter. And so it seems a little tricky to sort of try to hand that off to an automated process to me, because there's not really a ground truth you're aiming for of the right answer. But I don't know, maybe.
Thanks for that.
Great. Nancy, if you'd like to ask another question to the panelists or to the audience.
I think we have Maya on stage too. And Maya, if you can unmute and ask a question, that'd be great.
Thank you so much. My name is Maya. I used to work for Twitter for 4 years, and thank you so much for amazing discussion. This is a interesting time, and I've been decentralized identity space for past 3 years. From Indicio, we have our own network, and we use DID for corporate solutions. So my question is, what do you guys think of, this is just idea, if we create the consortium kind of things, and maybe that those social media company can join to keep that like name would be interpretable for different social medias. I think nobody has made it yet, that kind of things. And also there's always bad guy involved. So we need KYCs. Do you know anybody has creating those consortium kind of things? And what do you guys think of the idea?
Are you thinking about company consortiums or technical consortium standards?
Standard or protocol, or you guys talk about that, nobody's really cross-function, like cross-chain or cross-social media to like protect the identity, right? Like one or the other. It would be nice to have one like protocol or something. It's just idea because nobody has done that yet.
Great, thanks for the question, Maya. And we'll have OA on deck. And any of the panelists would like to take that?
Arguably, that's what DNS did. It was a bunch of people who got together and said, we're going to assign top level domains and sell the domain names there and make sure that no two people have the same domain name. I think DNS probably doesn't get enough credit for being arguably the most successful coordinated sharing of a namespace in human history.
Thank you.
I would also say that, rough consensus and running code, it's how we built the internet, and it's how we're going to build this stuff too.
Loose consensus is tough for a namespace, though.
But in many ways, that's actually how the DNS system works. I mean, the rough consensus and running code is the, unofficial IETF motto, and that's the, the other half of ICANN. And, ICANN's choice on governance is to be very limited. It's to manage these root name servers, manage a process by which other people can handle disputes, and open up a system that everybody can agree to participate in. It's not perfect, But I would say that the way in which DNS standards and all IETF standards come about is this, it's not a formal process the way IEEE is, or even the W3C. It's much more of an evolved process of bringing people to consensus about what works. And I think when we're evolving decentralized web standards, we need to use that model because it works.
Thanks for your question, Maya. And we'll move on to OA, and we'll have Dan Greta on spec. A follow-up, Maya? Go ahead.
Well, I said thank you so much, everyone.
Sure. OA, please, and Dan Greta, you're on.
Hello, everyone. You bring up some very good points, all of you. To follow the previous speaker about the ICANN model, unfortunately, the DNS root servers, 13 of them, could be attacked. And if I understand the triple redundancy times, 4, plus a backup system. But the problem is, how can we make the system more robust and more resilient in today's world of unfortunately, cyber warfare and hybrid warfare? And so the other, to follow up with what the topic is, the decentralized user experience, or what Maya said, standards would be a great idea. For example, I'm looking at, I'm thinking of OpenID, for example, or a standard. I designed a system about 10 years ago that was supposed to basically be like a decentralized Facebook, like 14 years ago, I should say. And basically, you can decide to make something public by just making your public key. Basically allowing everyone to view. You could send the public key. You would basically own your data, and you could put it up on any web server. And it was a very simple model. If you want to make it private, you just withdraw the public group from your encrypted profile, and now the public cannot encrypt it. Only those who can encrypt your profile can view it, and it's very easy to add or revoke people. You can migrate your data as you wish. There are other projects that have taken a similar model, but for something like Bluesky, it's a little harder because there's more attack surfaces there. But yes, the standards idea is a great one. But as far as decentralized user experience goes, are you thinking more of having a model of basically just having certain data, and then you can kind of abstract everything, and you just want to basically, no matter what language or however you want to display it? It's sort of like, let's use an analogy, sort of like Linux. Linux is the kernel. You have a user line on top of it, and you can use whatever window manager you want. You can of course need X, but you can use KDE, you can use GNOME 2, you can use Cinnamon, you can use Mate, etc. Is that sort of how you're approaching it? You kind of GUI agnostic. You have the same data, and people can pick and choose whichever user interface they want. And I'm sorry to hop around a little bit, but all of you saying very good points, and I just wanted to touch on all of them.
Thanks for your fascinating question, Oe. Just to clarify, the panelists are not building a Bluesky. They're part of the Bluesky community, and so this is discussion topics, to share ideas. But again, thanks for your question, and we'll have Dan Greta next. Any of the panelists would like to take that? Panelist or Aaron? Now we're panel.
I would say this, that there's a variety of things. Some of us are building, or some of the projects are building different views on the same data and the same networks, and then other people are trying to build networks that have sort of different fundamental rules about how they work. And it's not clear that we want to or will unify them all or bridge them all. In the case of Planetary, where I'm building an app, there's also another app, Miniverse and Patchbox, and a couple others. And we don't all support exactly the same features, but we do support interop. We're not obligated to upgrade or support anyone else's things because it's a decentralized system. But when one of us comes up with something that's interesting, the others come in and support it. And so I think that you're going to have a world where no app supports everything and no implementation supports everything. But each group of people who are creating an application, whether or not it's an open source project or a company or both, are going to decide what sets of things people build. And then because they're based on open protocols, third-party people can go in and build their own visualizations or bridges or other tools on top of it in a way that you can't really without being inside some of the companies on the centralized stuff. And so, but I don't think unification is ever going to happen, and that's okay.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, this is Blaine. Yeah, I think just to add to that, I was going to make a comment about. I thought what Patricia said on this was really important. This idea that coherence is better than consistency. Like, we need to ask ourselves what is the point of interop, right? And I think the point of interop for me, I always went back to like when Instagram was starting. My grandmother used Facebook at the time, pre-Instagram, and I didn't use Facebook, but I still wanted to see her photos. And I actually didn't care about the company that she used. I just wanted to see her photos. Like, that's the point. And so I think we abstract this idea of interop so broadly that we lose sight of the actual goals. And sometimes we frame the technical challenge as though we were going to make phone calls interoperable with Instagram. But to say that out loud is meaningless, right? Like, how do you interoperate between telephone calls and Instagram? It doesn't make any sense. And so, each of these, this federation, like the internet, it's a layer cake of protocols. And some of them we might be able to reuse for certain purposes, but ultimately when we get to the user experience side of things, I think interoperability has to be evaluated in that situated way. So I think that's basically the point that Patricia was trying to make, but I think that's relevant here and important for us all to keep in mind when we're thinking about these things.
Okay, we'll take Greta, followed by Chris. Chris on deck. Greta, do you have a question? Okay, so we'll take Chris as speaker.
Greta has her hand up.
Yeah, I think she just needs to unmute.
Yeah, Greta, can you unmute? Unmute. Speaking of UX challenges.
Maybe they are on the desktop, and I don't think they can speak if they're on desktop.
Do you hear, Greta?
Oh.
Mic's off on me. They were waving. I don't know if you hear that or not. It might be a Twitter glitch.
Let's go to the next question.
Yeah. Robert, you mentioned Chris. I don't see them.
No, they might have dropped off as well. Nancy, go ahead and give your next question, please.
Yeah, just listening to all of this, I was thinking about Jack's tweet yesterday. I don't know if all of you saw what he tweeted. I guess it started with Elon Musk saying Twitter should be open source, and then Jack tweeting the algorithm that a user chooses, that should be the choice, not necessarily individual platform and how they share data or social graph. I don't know if the speakers here saw that tweet and have any thoughts or comments.
I mean, I'll talk a little bit about sort of the Bluesky discussions around that. This is stuff that Jay and Golda wrote up with some of the Bluesky roadmaps, is that there needs to be an interface and a set of services by which people could provide algorithms for your feeds and your content. So rather than having it unified in that the organization or the technology that hosts your content or displays the app to you is also the one that decides the order of the messages and what to highlight to you. Rather, we'll need to define an API by which you could choose which service is deciding what content to highlight, and that can be distinct and separate from the service that is designing the app that you see or hosting your content. I think that at this point, that sort of pluggable architecture on how to do that is wishful thinking and ideas, but it does give us a model by which we control the algorithms of our feeds by deciding who the provider is and whether or not that's something you host yourself or something that Twitter provides or Planetary or a community open source project. I think that we aren't going to have people going in and, for the most part, tweaking and deciding or coding their own algorithms, but we can build a system by which users have that space and that control. One of the things that at the Center for Civic Media folks researched was the fact that the algorithms itself, the data that goes into them is relatively simple and tractable. The algorithms with machine learning often are very hard for even the creators to understand. And so users have to decide on them based on looking at the effects versus like reading the code. And so I think that if we had something like an app store for social feed algorithms, then we could let people plug in their own. And I think that that's, it's hard to build and it's a future idea, but I think that it's one of the things about Bluesky that excites me.
I just wanted to mention one proof point from my work that has sort of demonstrated, I think, why this might be interesting is the Twemex extension. So the core interaction of Twemex is basically add a sidebar to Twitter where if you're on someone's profile, it sorts all of their tweets by number of likes, not by time. Very simple algorithm, right? And it turns out that this creates a totally different mode of interacting with the service where you're much less focused on what someone just did today, and you're sort of seeing the best stuff they've ever posted. Now, of course, number of likes is not necessarily the best proxy metric for quality, but it is a very simple signal that we can use, and people love it. At least some people love it. I've had some users tell me they hid the main Twitter timeline and just used Twemex, and they just sort through people's profiles and see the most liked tweets they've ever posted. And so that gives me optimism that just essentially, this ability to plug and play your own sort order can profoundly change the experience of interacting with an existing service. And these algorithms don't necessarily have to be that complicated. We're not trying to squeeze out every last cent of ad revenue here necessarily. So yeah, I find that quite interesting.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, what Rabel mentioned, it's from a user's perspective, it's not that they're going to read what the algorithm does and choose it accordingly. It's the end result and seeing for themselves what the feed looks like with a different algorithm. I guess like Geoffrey, Twemex, you've pulled that. How dependent is it on Twitter? If Twitter tomorrow decides to, block it in some way, is that a feasibility? Or I guess that's just the nature of working in the Web 2 model.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's actually, I think, pretty hard to block because it's a browser extension, which means that it can go through the user's own Twitter client. It doesn't actually go through the public API. So it's almost as if, it's like the Twitter client, the first party client is just doing stuff on your behalf almost. So I think that's good. Sometimes people ask me, are you worried Twitter is going to like shut you down or build this feature themselves? And I think my general answer to that is I doubt that Twitter would ever build the kinds of things I'm building because it's so niche. I don't see it as a particularly mainstream thing, which is fine. It's sort of the whole point of this discussion, right? Like there's a relatively small group of people. It's thousands of people, not millions, who want to use Twitter this way, and they should get to use this weird client. And it's fine if Twitter PM doesn't want to prioritize these use cases, but we should still have a way to access them. So yeah.
Love it. Love it how you've built it in the browser and the client has full control on it. Wait, I believe you have another question.
Yes, ma'am. I'm so sorry, guys. I work in cybersecurity. My job is to be the a-hole in the room. You have some great points, Rabel and Blair. I would love to connect with you all. But the 4 questions I have, I'm typing the last one now. First one, I love decentralization. I support it myself. I work in those kind of systems myself. And I specialize in secure communications technologies. So obviously, this conversation is of high interest to me. But one, what if nodes are being compromised? For example, look at how Tor servers are compromised, and so they can compromise traffic. And I was just wondering how, if you all have thought about fail-safes for that, because that's always going to be unfortunate. There's always going to be bad actors. And while I support people running their own nodes, of course, being able to download and migrate your data to wherever, if you want to host your own infrastructure or upload it somewhere else, you should be able to control your data. I think we can agree on that. 2, I designed a model called Decent. It stands for Decentralized Centralization, DEs in parentheses. And it's basically a model that it supports decentralization. So it supports centralized infrastructure for efficiency. But then in case there's nodes or connections are either impaired, damaged, or if there's a compromise, it can quickly decentralize and self-heal. And it can adapt depending on the threshold that you want it to have or the risk assessment it has, whether it stays decentralized and it spawns subnetworks, or if it goes back to a centralized model with redundancies and parity. I just thought you all might be interested in that kind of a thing. 3, I was looking at Russia disconnecting their internet. They want to basically disconnect any kind of internet peering and make their massive Russian walled garden. If you had Bluesky operating in Russia last year, and Russia said, okay, we want to disconnect from the internet, how could people either adapt or build their own Bluesky there, or even with the Russian government being hostile to Western, for example, media and internet? And 2, while it's decentralized and it might connect and work with Russian internet, how can you make sure that people inside of Russia can still communicate in a secure way? And I'm designing this to work. And then 4, bots and go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you. We'll take your questions from here.
I apologize.
That's okay.
I might jump in with a controversial opinion here. I think in the threat model case, and I'll actually go sort of in the Russian direction with this. If we look at something like Signal, where Moxie has sort of famously said that Federation, Moxie's the founder of Signal and developed the protocols behind it, has famously said that interop isn't viable because it constrains innovation. Which we've talked about on the call, and it's definitely true, but I think it's a technologically solipsistic position to say that we can't innovate with Federation. But also, speaking from threat models, Moxie's priority is security, but really Signal's threat model is Moxie, because if Moxie is a Fed, for example, he can ship a new version of Signal that backdoors everything, and you would never know. And so interop basically routes around that threat model, even if it's less secure than Signal, from like a cryptographic perspective. So I think there's a lot of factors at play in this stuff, and the reason I wanted to sort of touch on that is because I think a lot of the time, it's us technologists who are working on these problems, but we lose sight of what people actually want to do with the technology. And if we look at like Ukraine or whatever, in the field, people are probably using really insecure technologies right now because of their limited internet and their limited ability to operate in the world. And the fact that they don't have access to double ratchet encryption doesn't matter to them. They just need to be able to send a message, and so much of the communications in the field are just like unencrypted radios. So I think we need to, as technologists, really temper what we're trying to achieve and really refocus users. And that's why I think this discussion is so important in terms of UX. It's just like, we need to be thinking where the users are.
Well, designed by Pixel on deck. Any other responses to the questions? Okay, please, designed by Pixel, you have the mic.
Hi, designed by Pixel Girl, or you can just say Pixel Girl for short. I just got here. My attention was caught by the user experience part. I'm a designer, as you can pretty much figure out from my Twitter handle. What I am focusing on is not just making things look pretty, glitzy, and push the pixels, but I also look at the like the concept of a user interface, how to make it easy enough to use, even though there is like a complex or complicated tech behind it. So especially in like stressful environments or dangerous environments, so you're able to interact with the outside world or do whatever you have to do in a very effective way. So that's basically what I'm focusing on.
Yeah, we can certainly have decentralized identifiers, but it's very difficult to get someone to be like, okay, let me check if this is the right 64 digits of hexadecimal to identify the person I think I'm talking to.
I'm sorry, again, please?
In the decentralized world, you often have difficulty in the recognizability of names, because if I'm going to pick names based on some public key, that tends to be very difficult and not very human meaningful to people. But if I pick nice short human names, how do I know that there aren't 12 different people who are all Aaron on the system? And how do I know who I'm talking to?
Shall we have a quick summary from each of the panelists and Aaron as well?
Yeah, Rabo, Blaine, Aaron, thank you so much for joining. I would love to do some closing remarks, but I believe, Rabo, we have John here, John Henshaw. If he
yes, please go ahead.
So when Bluesky was first announced, I got pretty excited about it. I eventually was able to get access to the Matrix chat when y'all were on that. I would say leading up to that, this is something, decentralized social is something I've wanted for quite some time. It was really unfortunate that Diaspora kind of stalled. It was unfortunate that Tent.io, didn't go anywhere. I think because it had its own issues. So when this came along, I was like, wow, this is great. And it kind of has the backing of Jack. And but when I got into that chat, I actually never interacted with anybody. I just kind of observed, and what I saw were a lot of really smart people who had come up with really interesting solutions that were all different from each other, and it was as if I was looking at a committee of chaos, like in a sense, where from my perspective, if I were looking out at what was already out there, I was looking at Mastodon, and I was looking at the ActivityPub protocol and seeing things that are already there, and also under my definition of decentralized, which is more akin to email, not this idea of blockchain and Web3. Decentralized doesn't have to be that, at least in my definition. And so I was, really hoping for something like that. And instead it was, again, from my perspective, it just seemed like so many different people trying to push their idea of what something should be. And it felt really over-engineered, and it still feels over-engineered as far as like how this is trying to come together. And all that to say, my question is, how come we can't take something that already exist and try to make it better? How come when we have a good proof of concept, we already have design patterns for how this works? That's why Facebook and Twitter and so on kind of function the same in regards to replying and reacting and stuff like that. Why can't we work on something like ActivityPub and a model like Mastodon and build upon that? Why does it have to be this, and again, in my opinion, over-engineered Web3 utopia that solves every possible problem that's ever been conceived by very intelligent people? Why can't we do that?
I mean, so the Fediverse and Mastodon and ActivityPub are great, but they didn't succeed, and there are things that are holding it back. And I think that there was, a fair amount of participation from folks who were experienced in the Fediverse and ActivityPub in the very early meetings around Bluesky. I think that, but I also think that that's a model based on what we needed 15 years ago. And I think that there's a whole series of applications that we need to build now that aren't just, federating the existing old thing. And, for example, there's no way to do end-to-end encrypted private groups in the Fediverse because you have to trust the servers that host things. And there's no way to do end-to-end encryption. And there's no way to build a whole series of applications that aren't necessarily just the straight, social feed setup. One of the things that TikTok showed us is that the follower model might be fundamentally flawed. And honestly, all of the work on algorithmic feeds essentially comes down to a rejection of the follower model as well. It says that there's better ways to decide what you see. And so I think that we need to learn from that. I think we need to collaborate with it. But I think that if it were going to work, it would have worked. And so we should just build on top of it and build on top of other things.
What is broken with Mastodon? I mean, I'm curious to know, what is broken? Because when you say a 15-year-old thing and it's old, it's not old to me. I mean, it's fundamentally how I use Twitter and Facebook. It seems like what needs to happen is that we would to me, the problem with Mastodon is I can't install it like I do WordPress. That's actually the problem. The problem is it's just a little too complicated for average people to do. And I feel like most of the solutions that are being discussed in Bluesky are incredibly complex and complicated, very similar to just any Web3 conversation, that it's just too difficult for regular people who have some ability to do some things with a web server or PHP to even conceivably set up for themselves.
I'm curious if Blaine could speak up because he has a lot of thoughts about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of you are right. I mean, I think on the one hand, Mastodon does solve a lot of problems, and when I built Federation at Twitter 14 years ago or whatever it was, that was using the XMPP protocol, but all of the standards that came out of our early work, like the work that Chris and many others and I did back in sort of 2007 through 2010, activity streams, ActivityPub, WebFinger, all of these things were really just like, okay, XMPP didn't work, and there are a bunch of reasons that we don't need to get into here. But how do we replicate that using basically HTTP? Is all of that work, and I think there's nothing preventing us from using that technology other than I think, John, you're exactly right. We just don't have very good software for it. It's really hard to set up new instances. It's hard to iterate on them. and it's focused at, I think one of the biggest problems with Mastodon as it stands is that it's focused on competing with Twitter. And as long as Twitter, which has sort of captured I'll say a virtual monopoly in the space, as long as Twitter doesn't want to interoperate with Mastodon, then you're always fighting against those network effects. And I think it would be really interesting to see a new social network emerge that had a different social object, a different thing that you were being social about, that wasn't competing, therefore it wasn't competing with Twitter, and so a differently shaped Mastodon. I don't know what that would be, but like obviously TikTok came out with a new social object. Instagram came out with a new social object. We need other new social objects, but we need them to be federated first.
Isn't that what Solid was supposed to do, or is that something completely different?
I think Solid is completely different. Yeah.
Okay.
So I would jump back in.
The same space with that. I guess my answer would be, I think we're still a little bit early in the how do you build distributed self-certifying things where the trust model works differently. When I look at computers, we had a whole bunch of custom operating systems. And then we saw people like IBM, and they made Multics and threw everything in it and went super second syndrome on the thing. And eventually there was a group that was like, oh my goodness, Multics is so complicated. This is never going to work. We need a much, much simpler version of this. Unify all the things instead of multiple options. And they made Unix. And Unix ended up taking over the world. And I feel like the place where we are in a lot of these systems right now, and why it seems like such a cacophony, is we're kind of building Multics right next now. And parts of it are going to work well, and parts of it are going to work terribly. And it's probably going to be the sort of next generation after that where someone goes, oh, turns out 98% of this was unnecessary complexity. Here is the 2% that I can bring it back to. This is the Unix that is going to come out of the kind of Multics of messiness that is the Bluesky community as I've seen it so far. And it's like, here's a bunch of technologies. And I think that's when we're going to get stuff that is really simple and easy to use and can have good user experiences built on top of it. And then you're going to get the like Linux takes over the world. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I really appreciate all these answers. I mean, it's very interesting and educational. I appreciate it.
Which, by the way, doesn't mean we shouldn't make much simpler systems in the meantime based on all the protocols that are already popular to solve real problems that people right now.
One thing that's not, I don't think it's well enough communicated, but the reality is that the Bluesky project, in terms of what Jay, Golda, and the rest of the folks are actually building, is essentially an iteration on top of sort of a mix between matrix and activity streams. And so it isn't throwing away activity streams, ActivityPub, and the Fediverse, but instead it's saying that that level of encoding content and structuring the content needs to be merged with something that supports better encryption and peer-to-peer connections and a better federated system and a better system of bridging. And so my suspicion is that what we'll end up with is something that looks like a child of activity streams and matrix and Twitter together, sort of a polyamorous technological love child of the three of those. And so is it new? Yes and no. Is it? But it is combining things that work, and I don't think it's rejecting the work that's been done in the activity streams in the Fediverse space.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think that's a really important point. And the other thing that is so critical in all of this is that it's not the technology. We've had the technology for a long time to be able to do this, and there have been a whole bunch of different technologies that would work. And I think to Aaron's point, like, are actually simple enough and clean enough and work as models. The thing that's been missing has been, to go back all the way to the business model point that was made much earlier, the will from basically organizations with power. because individuals can do this, but ultimately this is a question of power, and it's a question of control, and it's a question of coordination at like a large social scale. And we have to have the will to do it. So in my day job, I work for a media company, and I've played around with trying to get distributed, decentralized technologies adopted. And the reality is media companies are pretty conservative. And so it's been a real uphill battle. If Twitter shipped Bluesky tomorrow, I guarantee that every media company in the world would join that bandwagon. And so the problem isn't technological, it's social, as so often is the case. So I think that's a big factor here.
Wonderful. Shall we go around with some closing remarks? Ladies first. Patrícia, would you like to, if you're still here?
She had to drop off, Robert.
Okay. Rebel, would you like to make some closing remarks?
Sure. I mean, I guess the closing remarks is that this isn't, we have been here before and we will be here again. It's a matter of continuing to experiment and build things and learn from the past, and that there is it's a combination of hard problems and finding the simplest solution that could possibly work. So I guess I'll conclude with that.
Blaine, Aaron, any closing remarks?
I think I will start by quoting Dr. Bose, who started a company that makes speakers some of you may have not heard of. His main argument was always, different isn't necessarily better, but better is necessarily different. If you're going to be in a world where there's lots of decentralized computers that are each trying to win market share while also being able to interoperate, they have to do something different in order to add more value and in order to innovate. And whenever you do something different, that is going to create some kind of challenge on another person who's on a different platform, running a different version of the app, maybe just using dark mode instead of light mode. Everywhere that there's differences, you're going to have to make this decision of, do I want this to be, to quote earlier, consistent, or is it enough to just be coherent and say, I'm going to do a thing, you're going to do a different thing, these things are going to work together. So the user experience is not something that you're going to solve and be like, hey, I've discovered the correct API for doing decentralized user experience. We're always going to be in this game of trade-offs of, when is it worth my behaving differently and not quite interoperating as well in order to get that benefit? And when is it time for me to say, okay, this particular version of this artifact has clearly won. I'm going to drop my version of post for somebody else's version of post, because that is what the community has sort of come around. And that we don't need it to be perfectly aligned. It is entirely possible for a community to decide they want version A, even if 90% of the world uses version B, and that's okay. Loose consensus and running code. This is how the internet, and it seems to be working okay so far.
Yep, I agree 100% with that. I think what we're doing is moving culture online, but we're creating culture with code, and that's complicated, and it's something that we don't know virtually anything about yet. Partially because so far all of the attempts that we've been successful at in moving culture into online spaces have been controlled by companies, and if we want to, I think I keep going back to this idea that for me, decentralization is about giving communities the autonomy to self-determine, and that one sentence sort of wraps it up. But in order to do that, they have to be able to, all of those cultural processes that give us as humans sort of cultural adaptation and cultural diversity, we need to be able to encode in code, and that's incredibly difficult. And I think one of the reasons that I find Geoffrey's work on Cambria so important, because it opens the door to even being able to start to reason about that. And it's still early days, but it's, I mean, it's incredibly encouraging to me to see this conversation happening, because, 14 years ago, it was, just a handful of people having these conversations, and now there's quite a few more. And I think that's really what we need. We just need a lot of diversity and a lot of attempts and a lot of people trying and failing and learning how to do this. So, I think I felt, 14 years ago, I probably told Chris Messina, if I was still working on this when I'm 40, you have my permission to just kill me and put me out of my misery, because it hasn't worked. I'm 41, I'm not dead, but I still have hope. So I think I'll leave it at that.
I love that, Blaine. I think, just summarizing, we've been here before, like Rabel said. There have been attempts made in the past, but definitely right now it feels like there's a lot more energy, a lot more people, a lot more excitement around this topic. And we are seeing powerful people, smart people trying to solve this very challenging, difficult problem. And I appreciated you mentioning that this space was inspiring. I hope these conversations are pushing the envelope, even if it's a little by little. So thank you all, especially the speakers, but also the audience, for joining in and listening to this just amazing panel. I learned a lot. Off to you, Robert, if you have any closing remarks.
Thank you all. And please stay posted for our next Twitter space at the end of April. With that, thanks to all the audience, your questions, the panelists, and to you too, Manasi. Signing off, this is Robert Schwenker. Have a great day.